All right, so I've just watched the part one video, and I'm going to go ahead and do my reaction now and split this off from the part two one, just so the part two one is like a true reaction. Cool, man. Video part one. So, yeah, we started off talking about, all these pretty common postural problems. You've probably met a client with weak feet, with turned out feet, with weak hips, with weak, upper back. Yeah, the reality is like they're just so common in this field because they're so common in, day-to-day life. I think, most people live a lifestyle that does not support necessarily having strong mobile joints and good posture, which posture really I think is just like awareness of position and strength to maintain it. So I think people really lack on the strength component, and as a result have the really bad posture. Which is interesting as we kind of segue into the next point. Like, have you ever met anyone that has them all? So many times. And I think, like, if you meet somebody, the worse one thing is, the worse everything else is going to be, right? I've never met somebody with, like, really weak feet and a really strong mobile shoulder upper back complex. I've never met anybody with, like, debilitating shoulder dysfunction that has, like, a really strong core and lower back and glutes. So, yeah, I think, they go hand in hand, and I think, the worse one of them is, the worse the rest of them are. Now, the first question was, like, if you had someone presenting with kind of global postural issues, where would you start? My gut reaction, like everybody, is to pick one. So, the first thing I thought was the feet, right? Because I'm a track and field guy. When I write my warm-ups, I write them from the ground up. But even, in my time at Equinox, I found that for a lot of people, I could improve people's quality of life by just kind of correcting some of their foot, ankle, and hip complex a little bit. And then even when I was coaching high school track after that, a lot of those kids, really weak feet. And again, a small adjustment there in their training, and all of a sudden they run much faster times and their lower back start hurting and stop hurting and all that stuff. So, yeah. But then I thought harder about it because, that's kind of the point, right? So I was thinking more about it. And I guess where you really want to start is the most egregious one. So, we talk about if you have one, you probably have other dysfunctions. So, say somebody does have an upper back, a hip, and a foot or knee dysfunction. Which one is the worst? Let's start with that while we kind of work on everything to strengthen the whole body concurrently. But selecting whichever one is the most egregious place and actually starting there with the most pure intervention. The next question was like, where were you at the beginning, in the middle, and then now in terms of like perspective on the FMS? And again, like this is something I've worked with before, but I think definitely when you're taught the FMS in a commercial environment like Equinox, it's very different from being taught like the practical FMS. So since we started this whole process, I actually have gone out and watched some videos about, FMS instruction and stuff like that. And I think the first thing is the way that I taught was probably a very simplified version, and I can understand now how, had I been testing people a little bit stricter and more intentionally in my time, I probably would have picked up on more. But even as, the tool I was using it as, not to its full capacity, but I still, was able to spot a lot of dysfunction and, figure out where to start for a lot of people. After the second survey, when we talked, so much about its correlation to performance, I was a believer kind of at the beginning of that it doesn't really correlate necessarily to performance because, again, performance is such a vague and complicated thing. Very sport to sport. The anthropometric, even the body dimensions that are successful in athletics are completely different case to case. So, like, athletic performance is much more different to predict for than like global dysfunction or like especially general population dysfunction. So again, yeah, it's not a performance tool, but I kind of thought that going into it, but it definitely points out, what your most egregious dysfunctions are. I think where I'm at now is I'm more interested in kind of the design of each test and how they work in sequence with one another. I was always taught the FMS in a specific order, and I'm wondering now, was it like my manager at Equinox, that was the order that he liked, or is this an order that makes sense neurologically to test for certain things? So I think now, I'm still a believer in, the FMS as like a diagnostic tool for dysfunction again, but like yeah, I wouldn't have used it as a performance tool in the first place because, again, performance, what performance, you know? But yeah, now I think I'm interested in each of the test designs and kind of, you know, the sequence and everything. So, all right, that's the reflection for number one. I'm going to watch video 2 and then get that rocking and rolling.